The Rundown with Carrie Saldo podcast is funded by Armbrook Village Senior Living in Westfield with support services designed to help seniors age in place, including a Compass Memory Support Neighborhood. More at armbrookvillage.com.
This is The Rundown, your weekly news and review from Western Mass. I'm Carrie Saldo, tempting the fates. It's Friday the 13th here in September, but we've assembled a fearless group to delve into this week's news. NEPM News Director Sam Hudzik, Jim Kinney, reporter from The Republican and Mass Live, and Kevin Moran, executive editor of the Berkshire Eagle. Good morning to all of you, gentlemen.
Good morning, Carrie.
Later in the show, we will look at attempts to help combat housing shortage and affordability issues from Springfield to the Berkshires. Also, psychedelics on the ballot and a shakeup at the top of the Cannabis Control Commission. Do you have a thing or two to say about that or anything that comes up during the show? Email us, therundown@nepm.org. That's therundown@nepm.org. And now a reminder for those who forgot or perhaps repressed it from Tuesday, the presidential candidates Donald Trump and Kamala Harris met and debated for the first time Tuesday night. The script was flipped, I think, when compared to the June Trump-Biden debate. At the end of this debate, I think broadly speaking, Democrats were pretty excited about Harris's performance, and Republicans maybe less so about how Trump comported himself. It's been a few days here, panel. You've had a chance to hear some things from here and there, reflect on what you saw. Lasting thoughts from our rundowers here, Jim Kinney?
What's it with Trump and Vance and Kat, by the way? Why does that keep coming up?
It does seem to be a favorite meme / topic for both of them.
I think a measure of how well Trump really did is his unwillingness to do it again.
Right. Yes, he's come out and said that he does not feel the need. He feels like he had a strong showing. He won the debate. No need for a second crack at the bat. Okay. Kevin Moran?
Well, NBC did a really interesting sort of breakdown and how many, actually down to the second, how much time each candidate spent on a particular topic. Although Katz was not necessarily included here, I was kind of thinking along the lines of, what messages may have resonated to voters in Western Massachusetts. And certainly it was interesting to kind of figure out what they focused on. And by the numbers, NBC ran the time. And turns out the character and fitness, they both spent the most deal of time talking about that. And the economy was right behind there in second place. And so to me, I think those are probably two issues that are on the forefront of most voters' minds in Western Massachusetts, that's for sure. So.
Yeah. And I think affordable housing, too, which we will talk about here later in the show. Sam Hudzik, how about you?
I just really enjoyed the fact-checking that was done by the moderators in the debate.
Absolutely.
In the debates we've done, I know it's really hard to do that effectively, and they did it really well with a lot of the stuff that President Trump was saying. As Shira Schoenberg, a former Republican reporter who's now at the Boston Globe, pointed out, though, they did also have opportunities to press Harris, like about what abortion restrictions she would support, and didn't press her in the same sort of a way. So it would have been nice to see a little bit more of that. But I was just really impressed. It's really hard to do well, and I feel like those are some of the strongest parts of the debate.
I agree. I really felt I've moderated some debates, and it is really hard to do because you're keeping track of...
Some debates. You've moderated a bunch of debates.
It's really hard to keep track of what's happening in real time and live and keep the ball moving forward and pay attention to what is actually flying out of their mouths. So I was very proud of the debate moderators. I watched on ABC, don't tell my bosses, and there were commercials for the new Joker movie, Folie à Deux. Yes, you're welcome for the French there, folks. Not my first language, obviously. But I was curious, what is folie à deux? So I looked it up, me being me, and it's a disorder where two or more people share the same delusions. So for me, I'm like kind of thinking, was this some sort of commentary by either the right or the left, or maybe a metaphor for this entire political system that we're a part of right now? So that was the thing that stuck out to me following the debate. With less than 2 months to Election Day, obviously the fun will continue. And I am going to move us on to the topic that I mentioned earlier in the show, affordable housing, and how it relates to Western Massachusetts. It did come up as a national issue and certainly is hitting home here in Massachusetts. State House News Service reported this week that more people are leaving Massachusetts than arriving in almost every demographic category. What's driving people out? Among them, escalating housing costs. And one way that Massachusetts lawmakers hope to help this situation was this opening up of what's called opening up the potential to build what's called so-called ADUs, accessory dwelling units. And we occasionally call them granny flats or maybe in-law apartments, but the idea is a smaller living space on or near an existing single-family home. And Kevin Murray and Claire O'Callaghan, the housing reporter there for the Berkshire Eagle, recently took a look at these ADUs. Why was this a concept, something that the paper wanted to look into?
Well, first of all, Claire was hired specifically because housing is just an issue, just not in Berkshire County, but literally throughout the Commonwealth, especially in Western Massachusetts. And it's housing that opportunities that affect people at all levels. From just trying to find your basic apartment to something if you're looking to be able to afford move into your sort of next home perhaps and move out of your starter home. But Massachusetts really thinks that these so-called accessory dwelling units are opportunities for, in the quickest way, from point A to point B. How does Massachusetts develop more places, more apartments for people to stay at? And literally, it could be a space above your garage that you have, and it could be a space, a part of the house. It could be an outbuilding that you transform. But the key here is that Massachusetts lawmakers, and this legislation specifically, really allows cities and towns to clear aside some red tape. So any local zoning laws that may ordinarily hinder the development of these things, or even if towns don't have zoning laws, perhaps, that would affect or help the creation of ADUs. This does.
Right, because as I understand it, the Affordable Homes Act, that's the legislation that you're referring to there, allows these accessory dwelling units of 900 square feet or smaller just by right, where cities and towns in many places in the Berkshires and elsewhere here in Western Mass have said, hey, hang on, we're going to put some restrictions on these. If you're going to have them, you need to be a full-time resident of the house. You can't be renting it out for a short-term rental, or it has to be this size or this distance, or you can only rent it for a certain amount of time, things like that. Very specific, and people have said in Claire's reporting and elsewhere, onerous regulations attached to these, and the state's now coming in and saying, nope, 900 square feet, you own your house, have at it, build it up. And I checked in with the housing department yesterday, and what they said is they hope, the housing secretary Ed Augustus hopes that they'll have 8,000 to 10,000 of these ADUs built as a sort of result of this bylaw. They think other states that may have made similar moves have seen similar results. But the question for me there is, you've got to have the money to build these ADUs. Has Claire had any? I mean, some of those ADUs that Claire's reported on were $800,000. These are not like tiny houses.
No, certainly not. But sort of the ground level opportunity can be less expensive than $800,000.
I would hope.
Those are some Berkshire bucks at work there too. But the idea is to allow the person who has some space the ability to convert some homes or some parts of their properties that, there is a cost of entry. We know that inflation's high. We know that cost of building materials are high. We know that trying to get a contractor to call you back, and better yet, if they show up, that's amazing. But there are costs of entry. However, they're hoping the state once again sees that the homeowner and as a residential property owners can really speedily move along this track a lot faster than anything else.
One more question before I move it up to the wider panel. I know that especially in Lenox, the inn owners and bed and breakfast owners in particular liked these ADU restrictions because they don't want people coming in and using short-term rentals. They want them to stay at their establishments. Has Claire heard from anyone yet about, are they going to be picketing in downtown Lenox because the state has passed this law opening it up to ADUs, or just more conflict about how are the state and local bylaws around this going to be resolved?
No, I don't think there's anybody going to be protesting the in-law apartments that may be springing up in the Berkshire necessarily. But a lot of cities and towns actually see these particular dwellings as a more long-term, more sustainable thing than in short-term rentals or even just vacation rentals.
As I said, the state expects 8,000 to 10,000 of these in the next several years. Sam, did you have something you wanted to add?
I mean, I just thought it was really interesting from the reporting that quote from Cornelius Haas from the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, just about how now all of these bylaws are across the Berkshires or across a lot of places in the state, but you guys were reporting on the Berkshires, need to be rewritten. And you've got these small, tiny staffs in these towns and volunteer planning commissions. It's going to be really interesting to see how that shakes out. And I think there were some complaints about how quickly they were expecting towns to adapt.
Right.
They've got cities and towns have some work to do. They've got to react and act in order to tweak their current zoning bylaws maybe to comply by like February. So the clock is ticking on that.
That's when these are expected to roll out. And, ADUs could be one piece of this affordable housing puzzle, but there's also development on larger scale affordable apartments. One such site in Springfield saw a grand opening this week. Jim Kinney, and you were there. Give us an overview of that Knox apartment building project.
Well, between the Knox Automobile Company and the Indian Motorcycle Factory across the street, we're talking about roughly 300 apartments in a neighborhood in Mason Square. It's a very hard-bitten neighborhood done by a company, First Resource. They operate around the state, but they have a lot in Springfield, and they have a very good reputation for creating neighborhoods, treating people well, and then expecting that they treat the properties well with a lot of security, a lot of staff. The interesting thing is it was filled before the paint was dry. The demand far outstrips it. The people with First Resource had a big ribbon cutting in part to draw state officials out there to show them what they're doing, and then to lobby for the money in the state bond bill to come into a couple other projects up on State Street here in Springfield.
Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll was among the state leaders who came out here, and she said that she was pleased to see the redevelopment. Here's a little more of what she said.
As a former mayor, I know that's the vitality and the quality of life that you want to see happening. Imagining this place vacant, what it means to a neighborhood, and then imagining it full with families living here, it's just a game changer.
Game changer, says Lieutenant Governor. What about the rest of the panel?
I mean, it's a really important start, and I think that's sort of what they're getting at. In other stories, the Daily Hampshire Gazette reported on how that the Affordable Homes Act also includes $2 billion to fix up existing public housing units, and we've reported on this about the backlog for public housing, the backlog for Section 8 vouchers, just hundreds of thousands of names on that list, and each of those names representing a family. And I just think the housing director in Springfield has pointed out to us before, sort of as they're biting off project by project on this, that they're making improvements. And each of those projects represents a family that's got a new home or a community that's feeling more redeveloped. But the problem is enormous, and you're not going to handle that by a few dozen or even a few hundred units at a time.
Either whether it's affordable housing units, apartments, or these ADUs we talked about,
exactly.
Right? And that $2 billion that's being earmarked as part of this larger bond bill, as I understand it, is meant to chip away at some of that backlog that you mentioned. But the state itself only has 43,000 housing units across the state, and some of those are sitting vacant for up to 6 months while they figure out the turnaround process. It's incredibly complicated, and you would think I think the WBUR last reported it's 180,000 people trying to get into those 43,000 units.
Yeah, and it's twice or three times as big for the Section 8 wait list.
Yeah, just a really big and complex problem that we will not solve here this morning, but certainly keep talking about on the rundown. We are going to take a quick break, but still ahead, our news crew's thoughts on supporters trying to grow support for psychedelics on the ballot, reaction to a big decision in the state's cannabis industry, and of course, predictions, scoops, and praise. If you want to get in on the fun, email us therundown@nepm.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back to The Rundown. I'm Carrie Saldo, hanging out this morning and talking news with Kevin Moran, Sam Hudzig, and Jim Kinney. It's ballot question season, also high holy season for many a reporter, I believe. And advocates were in Springfield this week to tout benefits of psychedelic therapy, which is one of 5 ballot questions that voters will be able to weigh in on come November. If this question on psychedelics gains voter approval, it would allow people ages 21 and older to grow, possess, and use certain psychedelics. Amherst resident Anna Demi, was among those who spoke at a press conference, and she said after overdosing in 2019, a friend took her to a psychedelic treatment facility, and here's what she said about that experience.
I went for one night of service there, and on the other side of that night, I quit cigarettes. I was no longer on my 8 psychiatric meds, and I have been off of any street drugs since.
Pretty powerful endorsement there from her. Jim, you were among the reporters at the press conference. What did you take away from what you heard?
I was struck by how honest the people were who had had these experiences, admitting that maybe they wouldn't be here among us if it weren't for using these. And these are people who had dealt with anxiety and agoraphobia, and now they're in front of people like me with microphones and cameras and things. One of the other things that the advocates mentioned, and there is no organized opposition to this. There's a group that's formed, but they haven't raised money and they're not really active. The advocates say in their polling, support tends to break down not by political party, but by age, with around over 45 a little more skeptical. I think that's interesting, and it'll be fun to see that play out in November.
But then interesting, too, Sam, because Dusty Christensen was there for NEPM, and there was some veteran support for this, and certainly some older veterans in that room. So interesting to hear Jim's statistic in light of that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, PTSD, I think, is definitely one of the things that this is supposed to be able to address. You know, Karen Brown did a report on this a few years back when municipalities like Northampton were moving toward decriminalizing psychedelics. And I think it's really interesting as we've sort of seen this progression through the years. I remember when medical marijuana was first taking effect, everyone was like, "Oh, we're going to do recreational," and then I remember thinking, "Oh, recreational is not going to pass," and then recreational passed, and then right when recreational passed, everyone was like, "Mushrooms are next," and then I was like, "I'm not sure that's going to happen." And it's just sort of advancing, and I think what's interesting with each of these public debates is the conversation begins with the medical uses, right, and then the recreational uses sort of follow.
And I think what you're also saying is you are not the person to go to for gambling advice.
I'm terrible with all predictions. Yeah, right.
Jim, you mentioned that there's not really organized, there's not a lot of money raised by the opponents to this, but opponents do say that they're concerned that these substances could fall into the wrong hands, especially because the way I read this legislation in the handy red book that we all received or will be receiving from the State Secretary of State's office this week, it explains that you can grow these and at home in kind of a 12 by 12 garden box, I think maybe you could call it, or you would purchase the product at a licensed facility. They just don't want these falling into the hands of young people. They're worried that they might do more harm than good, especially for people with pre-existing conditions who might be ill-suited to use this type of psychedelic drug. Or that if you're selling at home in a 12 by 12 box, there's only so many mushrooms you can do yourself, and maybe you're going to sell them on the black market. So those are among the concerns. I referenced this red book, and as I was reading through it yesterday when it came to the House, the excise tax that's pointed out in the book would be 15%. And that was surprising to me for 2 reasons, because this is the use of psychedelics is being presented as a medicinal use, and there is no excise tax on medicinal marijuana in Massachusetts. And even the tax on recreational is 15%. The tax on recreational marijuana is 10.75%, and the proposed tax here for psychedelics is 15%. So it was interesting to me to see them taxing this not only for medicinal purposes as the opponents or proponents are saying, but at a much higher rate than the recreational marijuana that we see legal now. Kevin, any thoughts on psychedelics here on this ballot question?
Well, it seems to me that the state is going to have a lot of work to do if this question passes, because obviously, they've had, it's fair to say, some struggles with maintaining a clear and consistent system, regulatory system with regard to the Cannabis Control Commission in terms of the leadership there, that's for sure. And this one is obviously a new level, and if it passes, there's a lot of work to do. Put it that way.
Yeah, there's a commission, I think, right? It's going to create the Natural Psychedelic Substances Commission if it passes. And I think this is really interesting at the same time that all this upheaval at the Cannabis Control Commission and discussion of how to start over with that regulatory body. I think if it does pass, it sort of presents this opportunity about how can we sort of merge these two bodies in a way instead of having two struggling new, state agencies trying to come to grips with new industries.
Kevin and Sam, thank you for doing my job for me and bringing up our next topic, which is all of the moving and shaking that's happening at the Cannabis Control Commission. We did see a big decision in that industry this week. Commission Chair Shannon O'Brien was fired after nearly a year-long suspension. O'Brien says there were no grounds for it, and she intends to appeal the decision. Sam, NEPM's Kerry Healy checked in with the co-founder of Dazed Cannabis for reaction. What did he say about all of this?
Well, I mean, he said that he hasn't had any problems dealing with the people at the Cannabis Control Commission that he deals with as far as getting regulatory approval. They had the Holyoke one a few years back. The Munson one just opened up earlier this year. WGBH also talked to this nonprofit cannabis group called Equitable Opportunities Now, and they pointed out some of the improvements that the CCC has done in recent years, including reducing wait times for inspections. But overall, it is embarrassing that this agency has not had that sort of leadership in the way. And we all know if you've been in organizations that have had leadership, turnover at the top, it definitely affects frontline workers and their work and the efficiency through it. So I think it's just something to keep an eye on, definitely, as they figure that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the kids would say it's not a good look. It's not a good look what's been happening at the Cannabis Control Commission. Well, I'll turn to other news. Kevin, Clarence Vanto reported this for the Berkshire Eagle this week, that a student in Lenox was arrested following a threat made on Snapchat that was quickly flagged by the FBI. What's going on?
Yeah, it's, this next story is really it's evidence of a cautionary tale, and that is that, making bogus or fake threats against a school on social media will get one quickly dealt with by the authority. Even if you meant it as a joke, there's no excuse anymore, as we're learning from this story that's coming out of Lenox in the wake of especially the recent school shootings in Georgia. And you're right, as Clarence reported and continues to report, there's a student at the local high school who was detained after federal authorities using the software that they use to basically track all publicly available and to sift through all social media posts here. That particular software detected something and flagged it, which was then reviewed by an investigator, and that investigator deemed the threat
credible enough.
Well, credible enough that you're not taking any chances, and they called local police there, and we're told that within minutes, the Lenox police were at the high school and had taken the student into custody without incident. Now, it's important to keep in mind here that the student is a juvenile, is now actually facing charges for this, and that school officials say that no weapon was found, and it was, quote, a, quote, giant error by the student, but clearly one with serious consequences.
Yeah, what was remarkable to me about it was how quickly it seemed to happen. Like, this is not a Snapchat that was posted a week ago. I mean, they disappear in a certain amount of time anyway. But just for argument's sake, right, it wasn't posted a week ago. It was posted same day, and FBI contacted local authorities, and then local authorities were there. So I think there's some comfort maybe for the community in knowing that if, and again, as Clarence reported, this was not a credible threat or hasn't been deemed a credible threat, but just how quickly the response came. I think especially in wake of the recent school shooting where the mom unfortunately contacted the school, and the reporting out of that has been that the school didn't really take that seriously.
Well, the police had met with that young man in Georgia, and there's body cam photo of them talking with he and his dad, and you can tell the police are trying to do the son, we need to take this very seriously talk, and I'm not sure everybody in that family was taking it seriously, and then we have the tragic result.
Well, certainly a different instance in Lenox here where the matter was dealt with. Sam, I want to move on to something that Nancy Eve Cohen reported earlier this summer. There was hope that state trails would get some special attention from lawmakers, but it didn't. Give us the update on the lack of update here.
Yeah, so this is a bill State Senator Joe Comerford has pushed, and it would create a strategic planning, like a working group to assess the current trails that are accessible in the state and what sources of funding there are to improve and expand the numbers of them. And it didn't get attention during the formal session. Comerford's hoping that it gets some attention in the informal session. That requires, of course, to be passed, no objections from anyone who's in the chamber at the time. And this is about strategic planning and the importance of access to these trails. And it's a big health issue, which is, exactly what you'd think the state should be spending money on. But this isn't a big amount of money. This is just creates a working group. It doesn't allocate money for the trails.
Right, and then hopefully the idea would be that the trails would become more accessible, whether it's wider or removing roots and sticks.
And they'd have a plan in place for assessing how much funding is needed in the future.
Yep. Well, we'll certainly keep watching that. We're going to head on to our Scoops, Prediction, and Praise portion of the show, where we ask our panel to dish on a story they're talking about, make a prediction about the week's news, or perhaps sprinkle some praise on some reporting that you have seen or maybe even done in recent weeks. Jim Kinney, how about you? Scoop, prediction, praise?
My prediction is people in West Springfield will complain about the Big E despite choosing to live in the only city in New England that has the Big E.
Kevin Moran.
Hey, I want to heap some praise, and I want to heap that praise on the Republican from Springfield they're celebrating their 200th year. And congratulations to all your staff. We know that local journalists, have a tough job, and here's evidence that the passion continues and the cause remains the same.
Print lives.
Well said.
Sam Hudzig.
Well said. I've got praise for independent reporter Ben James. He worked on a project for us and New Hampshire Public Radio and Vermont Public. He rode his bike this summer, the full length from the Quebec border all the way down to Long Island Sound, the full length of the Connecticut River, and he took beautiful photographs and talked to people along the way and put together a whole series of stories that are all on our website. I encourage everyone to check them out. They
were so much fun and also somewhat heartbreaking to listen to. I mean, He just heard some really strikingly honest things that people who were perfect strangers told him. His ability to get people to open up in that way was just remarkable, and it was a great listen for the ears. I double down on what Sam said. I have praise this week for a Big E related thing. I am a huge fan of using the non-fare parking, so winding through the back streets and maybe parking on some random person's lawn. If you're able to walk and don't mind having a bit of a walk, it is my pro tip for how to park at the Big E. It saves, I think, a little bit of a headache and some of the stress of dealing with the parking there at the fair. I also predict that this year will be my son Logan's first crack at the big yellow slide. I'm at least going to try to convince him. Although I remember being a kid getting to the top of that thing and thinking, this is terrifying.
Yeah, it's just worse to walk back down the other way.
If you don't slide and head held in shame. I want to say thanks to this week's Rundowners, NEPM News Director Sam Hudzig, Jim Kinney, a reporter for the Berkshire Eagle, for the Republican, and Kevin Moran, executive editor of the Berkshire Eagle. The Rundown anthem is by The Love Crumbs. Our director is Tony Dunn. Our board op is Phil Bishop. Our engineers are Betsy Langto, Bart Rankin, Kara Foster, and Chuck Dubay. Additional team spirit provided by others in our newsroom, including John Sutton. Production support and digital is from Ayu Suryawan. Remember, if you have a topic that you want to explore here on The Rundown, email us, therundown@nepm.org. Have a great Friday.